Oh, hello. I saw some wavy faces just then as I came in. Hi, guys. Hi, everyone. How cold is it? Brr. I tell you what, I used to say I preferred cold weather over everything else, but I'm sure I'd adapt eventually. Till I have to think something I do. It's so nice to see so many friendly faces. So thank you for making the time tonight just to come on and for letting me do a quick brain dump to all of you about what happened in the last sitting fortnight down in Canberra. So it may feel, I don't know for you, but for me, it feels like it was some time ago, but it was actually only just over a week and a half ago since we were down in Canberra and we did a back-to-back fortnight. If you can believe it, we are currently now at week 29 in 2014. So we are over the hump mark and we are on our way down to the back end of the year. And in fact, I think even more kind of focusing for me is the fact we only have 7 weeks, parliamentary sitting weeks left in this year. So there's still a lot of work to get done before this year ends in Parliament. But it is, I think, going to be increasingly difficult because my observation is that the two major parties are very quickly shifting out of day-to-day business and moving into election mode. So I guess I just want to reassure you guys that my focus is going to be very much on holding the government to account to actually do the work they can do all the way through to the end of the 47th Parliament. It's not a parliamentary term of only 2 years or even 2.5 years. It's a parliamentary term of 3 years. And I think it is reasonable to expect our government to use every one of those days in that 3 years to, get stuff done that we want to see them get done. So honouring my commitment to you guys to try and get through this meeting tonight within 30 minutes, I'm really excited to say we've got Connor helping us tonight on the back end. So please be kind to Connor. Connor has joined our team and is taking over the operation of all our deliberative democracy and community engagement work going forward. So it's fantastic for us to have him. He's a real gun. And Connor will be moderating the chat tonight. So as always, if you have any questions, please feel free just to drop them in the chat. And then once I've gotten through everything I want to report to you, we'll do a quick check to see if there's anything that I can be answering for you straight away or not. So thanks so much, guys. As is always the case, the back-to-back fortnight, which went from the 24th of June through to the 4th of July, was a really busy period. So I think actually for myself personally, it felt like a really long stretch in Parliament because we'd literally had 2 weeks, 1 week break, and then another 2 weeks down there. So it was a pretty intense period of time. And if I could describe the last week to you, it felt like, I know many of you on tonight have kids or have had kids at school. It felt like that school term that was just 1 week too long. Like it really just felt like it was dragging out. But of course, in true, government style, they didn't hold back and they did drop a couple of quite significant pieces of legislation on us in that last week, hoping perhaps that we were a bit tired and we weren't going to be prepared to engage with them. But they should know us better. Hey, we certainly turned up. So I think one of the highlights of that sitting fortnight, though, was the work that I did with Senator David Pocock. I don't know whether many of you had a chance to see that, but actually working with David, we were able to simultaneously lodge the National Housing and Homelessness Plan Bill 2024. It's widely accepted that we're in the middle of a housing crisis here in Australia, and looking around at the people on this call tonight, I know that you are all very aware of that and have been actively engaged in conversations with me about what we need to be doing better. The truth of the matter is that the housing crisis is being driven because finding and maintaining a home, the costs of finding and maintaining a home are running at a much faster rate than wages are running in this country. And in fact, it's compounded by the fact that rental vacancies are so appallingly low at the moment. It might not surprise you, but I'm sure it disappoints you to hear that there's about 169,000 households are currently on the public housing waiting list here in Australia, with another 122,000 people experiencing homelessness. So the private members bill that David and I introduced would legislate a strong, ambitious, overarching framework to give coherence to our housing initiatives and to set a roadmap for the long-term reform. It drew its inspiration from Canada's National Housing Strategy Act, which was brought into being over there in 2019. And importantly, it sets out processes to develop, implement and maintain a national housing and homelessness plan aimed at facilitating a human rights-based approach to housing. Now, while it sets goals and objectives for the plan, and it does establish both an entity called the National Housing Consumer Council and an advocate called the National Housing Homelessness Advocate, it quite deliberately does not prescribe policies or programs to any government. So that would mean that the government of the day would still be responsible for its own plan. I think what's really important to know about this bill is that David and I didn't just pull it out of the air. Hal Pawson, who is somebody who worked with us on our deliberative democracy event here in North Sydney, was actually instrumental to the writing of it. And in fact, over 100 individuals and organisations, including leading academics, industry experts, economists, peak bodies and advocates, and politicians from both sides of the House, both current and past, were prepared to put their names behind the bill to say that they thought that it would be a good development in terms of housing strategy. And the reason I think that they were prepared to back it is because it fundamentally finally shifts the dial on what is a conversation that has been very much stop-start in our country. And it does that by setting the ground rules. So it kind of says it doesn't matter which major party is in government going forward. This is the way that development of any housing policy should be done in our nation. There was a flurry of media activity that came with the tabling of the bill because I think there were so many people were interested in how it would work. We were really successful in securing coverage through all the mainstream media channels. We've got a lot of pickup through digital media. And it's really pleasing. The bill's actually now been referred to the Economics Legislation Committee for an inquiry. So if you're at all interested in that, that committee is currently taking submissions. Submissions to that committee will close on August the 9th, and then there will be one day of public hearing. And then there'll be an inquiry report on the 10th of October. So in addition to that, I raised it with the Prime Minister directly. In fact, I actually put the Prime Minister on the record by asking him a question during question time as to whether he believed housing was a fundamental human right. And then myself and David actually met with the Minister for Housing, Julie Collins, to talk her through the bill and to understand why she would be hesitant to actually embrace this way of moving forward. So I'll continue to advocate for that reform in the months to come. I think why I'm so excited about this actual piece of legislation is I think it's quite akin to the early work that we saw Cathy McGowan and subsequently Helen Haynes do around the establishment of a National Anti-Corruption Commission. You know, I think what I'm learning through these government processes is sometimes you have to plant the seed and then be prepared to keep on tilling the soil around it to the point that you get the government to actually fall over the line and come in line with this. And I sincerely believe that this housing bill could be an example of what we could see in terms of long-term reform. The tabling of the bill, though, was particularly timely for me because at the same stage, so I tabled the bill in the morning, and then that same day I actually met with a group called Housing for the Aged Action Group, so short-term HAG. They're a community-based organisation that specialises in housing needs for older people at risk of homelessness. And devastatingly, they actually shared with me that they estimate that about 60% of women over the age of 60 in Australia at the moment are currently facing homelessness. Because we're getting a massive shift in our demographics. People are separating older in life. As women are separating, they're being left well behind in terms of super balances, and with the asset dispute, we're ending up with women being the fastest growing population of homeless people in our country. On the climate front, as I'm sure you would expect, climate action continued to be a key focus in the parliamentary fortnight, with a number of really important briefing events and roundtables taking place, and the government finally tabling their long-awaited legislation to establish both a National Environmental Protection Agency and an Agency for Environmental Data Collection. So from my perspective as a member of the Parliamentary Friendships Group for Future Generations, I was actively involved in continuing to advocate for the government to accept the duty of care obligation for young Australians. And I participated in a Future Generations dialogue roundtable where we actually discussed strategies to drive the government to deliver on that expectation. It was incredibly disappointing late in the first week for the government to then table a report that said they would not choose to enshrine a duty of care in their legislation. And I participated in a number of press events around that government stance. I actually think it's completely unacceptable. And I really, as I said at the time, if one of the government's primary responsibilities is not to look after future generations, I don't know really what it is all about. So David Pocock is spearheading that duty of care bill, but himself and my team are continuing to talk about it. And really excitingly, we have a duty of care event coming up in our electorate on the 28th of June. We've got an open air concert that we're partnering with the Duty of Care campaign team and Charlie Sharma and North Sydney Council to run. And the artistic lineup looks amazing. And it's a real moment for us to kind of reinvigorate this debate. Also, during the last sitting Fight Night, I met with key players in the climate risk finance and insurance sector to understand the challenges that we're facing and what we need to see our government do more of to ensure we're planning appropriately for climate adaptation and mitigation. I'm really glad you guys weren't in that briefing because it was actually pretty depressing in terms of how little work is being done around climate preparedness in our nation at the moment. I think my key takeout from that briefing, though, is that the sector, the industry, the country is waiting for our government to move. You know, they're waiting for the government to fire the gun and they are ready to go. But for some reason, our government is dragging its feet in this area. So again, I'll continue to prosecute that in the next 7 weeks, parliamentary sitting weeks. I also participated in a parliamentary event looking at the role of Australian gas in our future energy needs. And we know we get a lot of noise about this. One of the things I want to share with you is that I know for myself, what I frequently hear is the reason we have to keep extracting gas and opening up new gas reserves is there are foreign entities that rely on us for our gas, with one of the biggest of those being Japan and then also North Korea. Shockingly, what I've learned through briefings over the course of the last month is that 70% of the gas that Japan buys, they buy to on-sell to other markets. It's not for their own domestic market use. So in fact, we're effectively pimping our gas out to another nation so that they can simply make money of it. Bottom line, I think this government will go down as being judged for not having delivered on their climate promises. And I think that poses a really interesting opportunity for seats like and communities like this North Sydney community as we come into the next election round. In terms of cost of living advocacy, as you guys know, 1 in 8 Australians are currently living in poverty. And the fact of the matter is that nothing that we saw the government do in their budget early this year will either stop someone falling into poverty nor lift them up out of poverty. Disappointingly, the government chose to ignore their own committee's recommendations that one of the most important things they could do would be to lift the rate of job seeker to 90% of the pension. It was the second year in a row that the government has rejected that recommendation from that committee. So whilst I was in Canberra, I actually met with Cassandra Goldie, who's the CEO for ACOS, to discuss how I can help continue to prosecute the argument. So watch this space. I think there is definitely room for us to move there, and particularly given, as we've seen in this past week, the Treasurer has started talking about yet again another significant surplus that they weren't actually anticipating. On the women's economic security side, I met with a number of frontline service providers in the areas of women's safety to actually help them workshop how they could approach their federal government advocacy to get greater support from the federal government. There is one of the key issues we have with women's safety in this nation at the moment is the bottleneck between federal government and state and territory governments. And I think a classic example of that is that I know for a fact the Australian federal government has provided the funding to states and territories to place 500 new frontline workers right across our country. But as of this week, my understanding is that the states and territories who've had that money now for 12 months have only employed about 27 people. So our 27 out of 500 is barely a drop in the bucket. So I've been talking to Julie Collins about ways that she can apply pressure to the state governments to actually circumvent some of their processes and get this money down into grassroots organisations, because I can tell you from first-hand conversations that organisations like Women and Children First here on the North Shore and Mary's House, they are ready to go. They've got people they want to employ, they just can't get the money to do it. In terms of support for small business, it was a real pleasure. I was the keynote speaker for the RCSA, which is the peak body for the recruitment industry. They had a 2-day conference in Canberra. And I guess what's really interesting for me in that particular business sector is that we formed a kind of a mutual respect, in that when the government was looking to move their industrial relations reforms last year, they were advocating for same job, same pay. As somebody who previously had a stake in a recruitment agency through my ex-husband, I was able to go to the employment minister, Tony Burke, and say, do you understand how impossible this would be for somebody running a temp business? You know, we used to run, in that era, we were running up to 300 temps in a week. If that law had come through without exemption for recruitment industry, it would have meant somebody like our business would have been having to place those 300 temps, and every one of them would have been on salary conditions as per where they were being sent versus how we wanted to pay them. So I think the recruitment industry has come to appreciate the insight that we bring to the Parliament House on their behalf. So that was a bit of a win. It was quite funny though, because as the keynote speaker, I got to speak at what was quite a large event, and present at the event was everybody from Pauline Hanson to Susan Lay. And obviously when I stood up and started saying, well, you know, the reason this was possible was because the crossbench listened to you and we advocated for it, one by one those people drifted out of the room. So it was quite amusing. Also, whilst on small business, I continue to work with Allegra Spender and others on the crossbench to explore what may be possible in terms of broader tax reform. And in fact, next sitting fortnight, on the first Monday of that sitting fortnight, so the 12th of August, I'll be moving a motion calling the House's attention to the politicisation of tax reform in this country and how it's holding our economy back. So I'm looking forward to that. If I pivot to human rights, then you guys know me. You know me well enough to know there's going to be lots of work in this space. It was really wonderful. I got to meet with the new Race Discrimination Commissioner, Guridan Savraman, to get a better understanding about what he sees as a priority and what areas of work are going to be that he's going to be focused on moving forward. It was a fascinating conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to actually working with him, given the diverse nature of our electorate. I also attended a truth-telling session for women in prison as part of my responsibilities as a founding member for a new parliamentary friendships group for justice. So that group included engaging with a delegation of incredible women who have lived experience from inside. So one of those groups is Sisters Inside. The other group was a national network of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women and girls. And I've got to say, one of the things that was most stark to me was the overrepresentation of First Nations women and their sharing of stories about their experiences with the law compared to what they've witnessed with their non-Indigenous friends for similar circumstances. I mean, there were women there who had literally been locked up for parking fines. And so we definitely have a lot of work still to do there. I think, again, for me, this is potentially a real battleground going into the next election, because obviously we have Peter Dutton, who's recently come out saying he wants children to be charged as adults if they commit crimes, that he is bound by blood to children over the age of 10 being prosecuted as adults. So I think there is a real potential for a dialogue coming into the next election, which would really make us quite cruel and small-minded. So there's an opportunity for us to continue to speak out. I also met with delegates from Transparency International to discuss this government's lack of action on whistleblower protections. And this is actually really important, given that the Attorney General from the very early months of this government has been saying he was going to do reform for the Public Information Disclosure Act, which is the piece that protects whistleblowers. I guess for me, that meeting was quite ironic because, of course, we finally saw the release of Julian Assange in the second sitting week. And I do give real credit to the Prime Minister for securing Julian's release. Love him or hate him, I think the fact that we had an Australian citizen who had effectively been locked up for over a decade, it was the right thing to do for the Australian government to advocate for his release and his return. So I think that really was a bit of a win for them. And I think in what I heard on the ground, it wouldn't have happened without the Labor approach to negotiating his release. I also met with a really interesting delegation who are advocating for human rights in Hong Kong, including a young man called Sebastian Lay. Sebastian came with Peter Gressy, who is an international civil liberties expert. You might recognise his name. He was a journalist who was locked up. And he also came with Jennifer Robertson, who is Julian Assange's lawyer. Sebastian's father, Jimmy Lai, is a writer and the founder of Apple News and Apple Daily in Hong Kong. And currently he's on trial in Hong Kong under a controversial new law that they've created over there called the National Security Law. Now, Jimmy is 76. So he's actually the oldest and most high-profile political prisoner on the face of the earth at the moment. He's currently on trial and he's in solitary confinement. He could literally spend the rest of his life in prison for this pro-democracy writing and campaigning. So the British and US governments, the European Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, and 6 UN experts have all called for Lay's immediate and unconditional release. So I met with Jimmy's son, Sebastian, and those advocates to see what role I could play in getting the Australian government to come out and actually join those calls for Jimmy's release. There are obvious human rights issues in what's going on in Hong Kong at the moment, and press freedom issues. While that group was there with me, they actually shared a really disturbing story of a young woman who had left Hong Kong to do her university education in America. She went home for Christmas and was arrested at the airport under the same law because while she was in the US, she had been tweeting things on her X profile, and the Chinese bureaucracy had been monitoring her. So I think it's really important for all of us to continue to watch what goes on with Hong Kong as it becomes re-assimilated into China. I also hosted an event for a slight deviation. I hosted an event for young women experiencing metastatic breast cancer to launch a new resource that's been produced by an organisation called So Brave. It was such a privilege to do that. They're extraordinary young women, and So Brave had never been invited into the Parliament House before, but they turned up. They had their resource and they packed one of the major committee rooms. So I think there would have been over 100 people there, including a number of parliamentarians, to hear directly from them what it means to be a young woman experiencing breast cancer. You guys know how passionate I am about this area. Obviously, Jane McGrath's personal experience was as a young woman. And I still find it quite extraordinary that I know the things Jane originally was fighting for, so things like broader screening of younger women, more education of younger women, and actually general practitioners so they understand younger women can develop breast cancer. Those are still gaps in our system. So there is still work to do there. And I also participated in our first full day of public hearings looking into compulsory income management in Australia and whether there's a case for it or not. I think watch this space. It's going to be a doozy. As you know, I sit on a multi-partisan parliamentary joint committee, but what I can say is that we did not have members of the opposition present for all of the testimony. And in fact, when they joined the meeting, they did so to argue in favour of compulsory income management without actually having listened to the testimony of the people who are seeing it on the ground in the Northern Territory and Queensland. It was really disappointing. So in total, I spoke 11 times in 8 days when I was down in Canberra on topics as broad as the National Housing and Homelessness Bill, our Duty of Care concert, which will take place in North Sydney on Sunday the 28th, in favour of ending live sheep exports by sea. I spoke on the Natural Positive Bills, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Environmental Data Agency, and I spoke on the government's proposed changes to overseas students' study rights. I also spoke about our AEC boundary redistribution and the potential abolition of North Sydney because I thought it was a great opportunity to get that experience on the Hansard public record because interestingly, no one's talked about it in the House before. While still on conflict, though, the conflict in Gaza was again, a major focus of the major political parties as they use it as a political football. They're constantly trying to wedge each other whenever they get into the House. Having said that, I was really pleased to be able to vote in favour of a government motion that finally saw the recognition of the state of Palestine as part of an enduring peace solution. So, but I don't think it's going to get any easier down in Canberra in the next 7 weeks when it comes to that particular conflict. I also met with APAN, which is the Australian Palestinian Advocacy Network, to hear how they were doing and to hear directly from them what the experience of people with Palestinian heritage on the ground was. And as a result, I actively advocated for the government to open a humanitarian pathway for Palestinian citizens. It's something we did with Afghanistanis, Afghanis, sorry, it's something we did with Ukrainians. For some reason, the government has not sought to do that with Palestinians, and it seems like a very clear double standard. In terms of ministerial meetings, I had a number of ministerial briefings, including multiple meetings with Tanya Plibersek about her nature reform agenda and the fact that it wasn't going to meet our needs as a community, nor meet our expectations. Julie Collins on housing reform, Jason Clare on education reform, Amanda Rishworth on social services, Stephen Jones on treasury, Mark Butler on the new pharmacy agreement, and the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus on human rights. So I continue to enjoy a really positive working relationship with all of them. And in terms of things to watch out for, there's a bit coming. So I hope you've got your diaries, or come back and listen to this bit again. 28th of July, there's Our Future, Your Duty concert in North Sydney. Please help us spread the word there to anybody that you know, including yourselves, but particularly anyone under the age of about 32. It's an alcohol-free, drug-free event, free music, and Anjali Sharma is going to be central to that stage on that day, so it will be amazing to get an incredible turnout. On the 30th of July, then, I'm really excited. We are hosting a roundtable here in our electorate looking at technological abuse of women in our community. So we have an extraordinary group of 40 delegates who are coming together from all areas of this discussion. So from law to frontline services to people who can speak from lived experience, to actually try and create a moment that I can hold this government to account for doing the reform it needs to do in this space in a more timely fashion than they have done in terms of the physical safety of women. So that's incredibly powerful, and I'm looking forward to that. On the 8th of August, we have our next Aging Well seminar. This one is focused on dying well, death, dying and grief. It looks like an amazing program. It's going to run for half a day and includes an expo of facilities for people to tap into. On the 14th of August, I'm hosting a roundtable in Canberra with the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering on nuclear energy and its role here domestically. And I'm particularly looking forward to that because that panel will actually involve people who have come out here on the public record in Australia to say they do believe there's a role for nuclear, including people like Alan Finkel, who is a big advocate for hydrogen as well. Interestingly, though, in the context of that roundtable, we will be tabling a report which makes the clear economic argument and the clear time argument for why it is not an appropriate conversation for us to be having at this point in time, because even if we were to consider nuclear, it's at least 2 decades away, and therefore it's not going to get us out of the trouble we're in right now. We need to hold the course and stay the line with renewable energy. On the 16th of August, I'm travelling to Melbourne. I'll be a keynote speaker at the International Women's Forum. So that should be really interesting. And then on the 19th of August, I'm reintroducing my private members bill, which is the Migration Amendment Bill, putting limits on immigration detention in Australia. We are in the unfortunate situation that the numbers of people being detained in Nauru are increasing again. We're up around 100 people being held there now, and those people are still experiencing the same conditions that previous detainees had experienced, which fundamentally comes down to they have no line of sight on what their future looks like or what commitment the government might make to a timeline. My bill would make it illegal for the Australian government to hold anybody past 90 days, and it would also make it illegal for the government to put children in immigration detention, which at the moment they can do. On the 21st of August, then, I'm also co-hosting with Origin, which is a mental health charity, the release of a research report on the impacts of social media and youth mental health. So I think that will be a really interesting discussion for us to be able to spearhead as well. So lots of stuff going on. Here on the ground in the electorate, it's really lovely. I have 5 weeks here now in Sydney to do all the things that we haven't had a chance to do. The community's been extraordinary since the news of the AEC proposed redistribution to abolish our seat. The submissions for that proposal have now closed. They closed last Friday, but in total, I think there was nearly 800 submissions on the website, and I would say a good 2/3 of those, if not 3/4 of them, related in some way, shape or fashion to North Sydney. So at least, I think what's amazing about this community is that people have continued that commitment to speaking for themselves and ensuring that government and bureaucracy hears us when it comes to the things that are most important to us. So the process from here, that is now reopened, so people can comment further on those submissions. So if you know anybody who hasn't commented and you want to encourage them to go have a look, and potentially if they think we've done the right thing to say they support the submission we put in from the electorate office, please direct them that way. From there, we'll then get the next deliberation from an extended and augmented AEC committee, who will look at those proposals again and come back to us sometime in the next couple of months, I think. So that's me. Checking out the chat, I can see there's no questions. So obviously I've answered everything you could possibly want to know, which is fabulous. Thank you. And so with that said, I'm going to let you all go, because I'm sure you've all got pies in the oven, because you're probably getting ready to watch the State of Origin, because I'm running home to watch the State of Origin with my 21-year-old son. So as always, thank you for letting me do what I do. It is honestly the most extraordinary privilege of my life. And thanks for staying buckled in and continuing to fight with me, because, you know, together we are actually changing the climate in Canberra. So well done, you guys. Okay. See you later.